In what could be a possible turning point, Iran confirms it's held talks with regional rival Saudi Arabia. Hello, I'm Mike Walter filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been locked in a struggle for regional dominance for decades, and in recent years, their rivalry has been exacerbated by proxy wars across the Middle East. Confirmation this week that the two countries are engaged in direct talks is raising hopes for a de-escalation in tensions. There's a lot at stake, with efforts to end the 6-year Yemen war and talks to restore the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. For more on all of the developments, let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Tehran, Iran, is Mohammad Marandi. He's the chair of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Here in Washington, D.C., Jonathan Broder spent 20 years reporting from the Middle East and is a contributing editor at Congressional Quarterly and SpyTalk. From Maryland, Edmund Ghareeb is an academic and Middle East expert. And from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Salman Al-Ansari is the founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. And Salman, why don't I start with you? A spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry says there are talks going on. Let's listen.
As a responsible country, we must always be welcome to resolving issues and matters that have existed between our two countries. We hope, with the changing atmosphere, to be able to reach a meaningful understanding for bilateral relations and regional developments, and we'll make our best effort in this regard.
So, Salman, that's Iran's take. What's the view there in Riyadh? What do you make of these talks?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, I think the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman explicitly expressed in his televised interview a few days ago his assertion that Iran is a neighboring country and that Saudi Arabia is seeking a good and distinguished relationship with it, which will be in the interest of both nations and the stability of the region. But I think before we go into that, we have to go through the historical context. And perhaps many do not know that before the Iranian Revolution and Khomeini's arrival to power in 1979, Iranian-Saudi relations were going well. Rather, the strength of this relationship increased in the 1960s when Saudi Arabia helped Iran in several situations, such as its possible confrontation with the Soviet Union, and the two countries also cooperated in confronting some of the extreme nationalist movements in the region at the time. And also in 1971, Saudi Arabia and Iran were close enough to be considered to be the twin pillars of security in the Middle East, as described by the former President Richard Nixon.
So, Mohammed, you heard him describe the past. Can we get back to that point between these two countries, do you think?
Well, I think before the revolution, the Iranians believed that the countries of this region were more or less gendarmes for the United States, and that U.S. interests were being served by regional countries. And one of the main reasons for the revolution in Iran was because the Iranians wanted to begin the decision-making process at home and end that decision-making process at home rather than in Washington or in any other capital. And I think that's the reason why the United States has tried to mobilize countries in this region against Iran. The rivalry in this region is not really between Iran or any regional country. I think the problem is indeed between Iran and the United States. The United States has never forgiven Iran for the revolution, for taking an independent position, an independent role, and an independent foreign policy, such as Iran's support for Palestine and its opposition to apartheid in Palestine. And I think that what has happened since the revolution is that Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region have moved closer to the United States and are more deeply embedded in the American camp, and therefore they've become a part of this conflict between Iran and the United States.
Jonathan, the U.S. is kind of taking a hands-off approach to all of this, kind of watching from the sidelines. I saw one Iranian analyst say, as long as they stay out of this, the chances of success are probably pretty high. Is that how you view it as well?
Actually, no, I don't. I think that if we go back to the Trump administration, the Trump administration had a policy of, first of all, they withdrew from the Iran nuclear accord of 2015 and imposed sanctions on, reimposed sanctions on Iran, and even added extra ones as part of this campaign of maximum pressure on Iran. As a result of that, the Saudis were supporting the campaign of maximum pressure. And in 2019, when President Trump intensified this campaign, the Iranian view was if Iran could not export its oil out of the Gulf, then neither were the other countries going to be able to export their oil as well. And if you remember, in September of 2019, there was an attack by a combination of the Houthis in Yemen, who were supplied by the Iranians, and Iran, and they attacked with cruise missiles and drones the principal Saudi oil production facility, the Aramco facility, and they knocked out 50% of Iran's oil production, which accounted to 5% of the world's total oil production, and they knocked out that production for an entire month. Now, after that attack happened, the Saudis prevailed on the United States, or they begged the United States to respond. And Trump did not want to get more deeply involved in the Middle East, and he declined. And at that point, I think the Saudis realized that the old bargain between Franklin Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz back in 1945, in which the United States promised to protect Iran, Saudi Arabia from external enemies in return for reliable oil supplies at reasonable prices, that agreement was now shaky, if not dead. And at that point, I think quiet contacts between the Saudis and the Iranians began. And the acknowledgement of contacts between the two countries that we see today is a culmination of those secret talks that began in 2019.
Well, Jonathan, let me just ask you about tonal shifts then, because you brought up Donald Trump. Joe Biden's had a decidedly different approach towards both Saudi Arabia and Iran. Is that also kind of setting the table for these talks?
Yes, it really is. The entire dynamic has been changed now, because what Biden wants to do is revive the 2015 agreement. Now, the Saudis have been in bad favor in Washington as a result of largely the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which the CIA has blamed on the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And they need to sort of get back into the good graces of the United States. So what you've seen is a number of steps that the Saudis have taken, including lifting their embargo on Qatar, and now these talks between the Saudis and the Iranians. Another factor that is causing this to happen is the fact that the U.S. footprint in the Middle East is diminishing. The United States wants to withdraw largely its presence in the Middle East, or at least reduce it from the highs that it had during the time of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan.
Well, let me just interrupt for just a second and pick up on that. I want to ask Edmund about that. And obviously, you know, as he's talking about the United States withdrawing, there's a great deal of interest on another war, another flashpoint, Edmund, which is, of course, Yemen. There's been a 6-year war there. 100,000 people have died, 8 million people displaced. Talk to us about how these talks might change the shape of that. Of course, the United Nations saying recently that they feel like any efforts at a ceasefire are stalled. But if these two parties are talking, what does that mean for that war, which is viewed by so many as one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world today?
Clearly, the situation in Yemen is a tragic and a difficult situation. Saudis thought that they could bring about a change inside Yemen. As early as now, it's been almost more than 4 years, but that did not succeed. The Yemen conflict proved to be much tougher, much harder, than many people expected on both sides of the conflict. And that's why I think any attempt to improve relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran is likely to have some positive impact on the situation in Yemen. On the one hand, Iran and the Houthis, while there is some support for them, the relationship is not as close as it is with some of the militias in Iraq, for example, which are pro-Iranian or supported by Iran or allied with Iran, or Hezbollah in Lebanon. So basically these, I think, might be a better chance. Also, I want to emphasize a couple of other points. I agree very much with what Jonathan said about some of the factors contributing to this, primarily because the contacts between the Saudis and the Iranians did not start last month or after the meetings with Iraq, although those were to a new level, the kind of contacts that took place. In fact, go back almost a year and a half to 2 years ago, there were some low-level contacts between the two sides. In addition to that, I think the changes that have been taking place in the region, I think you mentioned the Biden factor as an important one. Yes, Trump and the Biden factor. The Saudis supported the policy of maximum pressure on Iran. They were much more concerned about Iran supporting proxies in the region. And at the same time, they were concerned about the missile capability of Iran, as well as the drones. And the Aramco issue was an extremely important one. But at the same time that this was happening, there are a lot of other changes. The U.S. is considered now not as reliable an ally as it was before, although the U.S. will continue to have very good relations with Saudi Arabia and vice versa. But the international situation is changing. With Russia, with China coming into the region, there is a rehabilitation with Syria. There is an attempt between Turkey to improve relations with the Gulf countries, with the UAE particularly, and Saudi Arabia. Qatar, we have seen an improvement between the Saudis and the Qataris. Egypt and Turkey also, there is less involvement by outside powers in Libya. So all of these are efforts at reach, in many ways, what I would call reconsolidation, retrenchment, and waiting to see what the future is going to bring.
Well, Salman, let me ask you about this. The United States is calling on Saudi Arabia to end the war in Yemen. What's the view there in Riyadh about this?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the Yemeni war, there are a lot of misconceptions about it. Let's not forget that it was backed by the United Nations Security Council 2216. And let's not forget the fact that it's a coalition to restore the legitimacy of Yemen. It has nothing to do with fighting a war between Saudi and Yemen. It's a war to kick out the Houthi Iranian-backed militia from the equation and to get them to the table so they can be an integral part of the political process rather than just a militia that takes power by force. And I think there are a lot of progress with that regard. Let's not forget that 80% of the Yemeni lands have been liberated. And let's also not forget the fact that Al-Qaeda, which has a stronghold in Al-Mukalla, in Hadramaut, in southern Yemen, has been also eliminated by the Saudi coalition. So there are a lot of good things that happened outside of this coalition that wanted to restore legitimacy. And when it comes to the U.S. Pressure, definitely, Saudi Arabia was actually even before the United States with regards to ending the war. And That's why they have implemented a ceasefire, but the Houthis, unfortunately, is not abiding by it, because definitely Iran is behind them, and they are the ones who call the shots, and specifically the IRGC. And I quote Mr. Zarif specifically for his leaks that diplomacy almost has no work, because IRGC and its leaders and Soleimani before, they were the ones who would dictate how the region or how their militias should function, etc. So, and I want to mention something important, Mike, because I mentioned the thing about the post or the pre-Khomeini period. But let's not forget about the post-Khomeini period. After 1979, sectarianism became the facade and identity of the Iranian state. And Khomeini's first decision was his declaration of hostility towards Saudi Arabia. Let's not forget, in 1948, during the first Gulf War, an Iranian F-4 fighter jet penetrated the Saudi airspace, and Saudi Arabia downed it and downed other two other jets. And in 1978, Iran ordered some Iranian pilgrims to create like massive violent riots in the Hajj.
It's important concept you're providing, but we can't go, we don't have, it's a half-hour show, we can't go through the whole history of these two countries and kind of the flashpoints. But Mohammad, I saw you smiling as he was talking about Yemen. I want to give you a chance to respond.
Yes, I think there's a great deal of historical revisionism there. First of all, I think it's quite clear that the Saudi regime has lost the war in Yemen. And it is not the Houthis. I think that's a derogatory way of describing the government in Sana'a. It's not even Ansarullah. It is the government in Sana'a. The Saudis and the United Arab Emirates and their Western allies did everything. They carried out genocide, they strangled the population, and they bombed the country to smithereens, school buses, weddings, funerals, you name it. But they couldn't take the capital, and that is because, and 80% of the Yemeni population is in the areas controlled by Ansarullah and its allies, the effective Yemeni government. That 80% that your guest is talking about, is mostly desert. There's no one there. So if they call that so-called liberated territory, that's fine. But the Yemeni population has resisted Saudi aggression, and they've won. Saudi Arabia, despite the huge amount of money that it has, and despite the fact that with the Americans and others they've created a siege, they've lost the war, and they have to accept the fact that the people of Yemen have defeated them. They cannot blame Iran. Anyone who looks at the map and the role that the United States has played knows where the problem lies. And for the Saudis to say that they defeated Al-Qaeda, it's well recorded that Saudi Arabia, as we speak, is using Al-Qaeda as well as ISIS in Yemen, just as they supported Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. We know that from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012.
Where is that? What is that?
It's just
nobody.
The U.S. Defense. The U.S. Defense Department. The U.S. Defense Intelligence. I didn't interrupt you, so I think you should not be afraid of.
Mohammad, if you could just make your final point, I'll give Salman a chance to respond real quick. But if you could just make it brief.
Yes, he shouldn't be afraid of me talking. The U.S. Defense. This is something without facts. Good. Just have some self-restraint, and unlike Mohammed bin Salman, show self-restraint, and we'll get done with the program.
This is a dialogue, and part of the program. Is
have some
go and
self-restraint.
interrupt others. It's fine. Didn't you hear?
Show some self-restraint. I showed self-restraint when you spoke. I just smiled, so you can smile too. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency the U.S. Intelligence Agency document of 2012, and the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency is the most important military intelligence organization in the world. It has 20,000 people working for it. That agency said that U.S. allies in the region were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. And the head of that agency at that time, the famous General Michael Flynn, admitted that the United States aided its allies in doing so. We know that Biden at Harvard University said that the Saudis were supporting the extremists in Syria. We know that American senior officials like Kerry spoke about this, and the documents are
Mohammad, I think you made your point. We got a lot to cover here, so I'm just Salman. If you could just make it brief, I'll give you a chance to respond, and then I want to talk about the talks in Vienna. Briefly, though, please.
Yeah, sure. I think all what Mr. Marandi is baseless at all what he said, basically. And when it comes to Al-Qaeda, if he wants to quote American intelligence, why doesn't he quote the U.S. Treasury Department that kept insistently publishing reports about Al-Qaeda leaders, operation leaders that are residing in Iran? And they are not just leaders who do nothing. They are actually managing the operations of Al-Qaeda. And let's not forget what Mike Pompeo has said, the former Secretary Department Minister. He said it very clearly that the new headquarters of Al-Qaeda is Iran. And nobody can deny that. And and where is Saif al-Adl? Saif al-Adl, the operation leader of Al-Qaeda. He's residing in Tehran. And what did he do? He orchestrated more than 65 bombings in Riyadh between 2003 till 2006. So what you are saying is preposterous. I'm so sorry.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there because I do want to talk about the nuclear talks in Vienna. And Mohammad, I'd like to ask you to respond. We heard from the EU foreign policy chief describing the talks. Let's listen to what he has to say, and then I want to get your reaction on the other side.
These remain an extremely delicate and intense diplomatic process. I dare to say that I am optimistic. There is a window of opportunity that will stay open for a couple of weeks until the end of the month, but a lot of work is needed, time is limited, and I hope that the negotiations will enter in a phase of non-stop in Vienna.
Mohammad, the old deal doesn't work for Iran or the United States. What would Iran like to see in a new deal?
No, the Iranians won't accept any changes to the deal. The Iranians have said very clearly that either the United States fulfills all of its obligations in the nuclear deal that was negotiated in 2015, or there's no deal. The Iranians are not going to appease the United States, because what happened in the past was that when the Iranians and the Americans negotiated the JCPOA, the Iranians made the mistake of first implementing their side of the bargain and then waiting for the Americans. And the Iranian commitments were all overseen by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. So they verified Iran's actions. But there was no verification mechanism for the American actions. And the US government, since the Iranians abided by all of their commitments, they began to drag their feet. And until the very last day of Obama's presidency, the United States never abided by its commitments, and there was never any way to gauge to what degree the Americans were abiding by their commitments. And I can give you just one example, and that is that when a group of bankers from the EU, from one EU country, an important EU country I won't name, came to Tehran, this was after the JCPOA, they came to see me at the University of Tehran because they wanted to discuss issues with me. And they said very openly that we want to do business in Iran, but the American government and the Treasury Department in particular had threatened them not to do business with Iran. So on paper, the Americans wrote one thing, but in reality, they were doing something else. So what the Iranians are saying is that this time around is either full implementation for full implementation, or there's no implementation.
So let me ask you this, Jonathan. He's talking about the United States. We saw Obama strike this deal. Then we saw Trump walk away from the deal. What can we expect from the Biden administration?
Well, the Biden administration is trying very, very hard to revive this agreement. But there are big obstacles standing in the way. And they range from the Israelis, who are dead set against this agreement. They realize that it very well may happen, but they have let the Americans know in no uncertain terms that they will not stop trying to prevent the nuclear program of Iran from going forward if they see advancements, that they will, while they don't openly take responsibility for recent attacks, we know what's happened. There were 2 explosions within a year at the main enrichment facility in Natanz. The latest one was just a few weeks ago. The one previous to that was in July of 2020. Various Iranian nuclear scientists have been murdered by assassins in Tehran. And the Israelis have let the Americans know that will continue if the program goes forward. Another obstacle is the Revolutionary Guards. They are against these talks. And there have been provocations by the Revolutionary Guard Navy in the Persian Gulf, where they have swarmed an American Coast Guard ship twice, requiring the ship to open fire and drive the Iranian fast patrol boats away. And the third obstacle are Republicans in the U.S. Congress. They are also against this agreement. So while Biden is committed to get this agreement back on track, he's facing some major obstacles.
Edmund, let me ask you this question. We started by discussing these talks going on. Let me ask you this. What happens if there is a deal struck by these 2 countries where relations improve? What does it mean for the entire region, do you think?
Well, certainly it's going to create a lot of problems. However, a great deal will depend on how the talks end. What we might see is that there might be a postponement if they don't reach an agreement by in the next 10 days or so, because there's also another problem, and that has to do with the deal between Iran and the nuclear agency, the international agency in Vienna, whether or not there's going to be continuing cooperation or not. So that's another factor. And then there's the election. If an agreement is not reached by then, probably what we are likely to see is people will wait until the results of the Iranian elections and then see what happens, whether the hardliners who are going to be the winners and are going to determine a different kind of policy, or will it be that group similar to the current group who want to continue the negotiations? So I think there might be a postponement, but whatever, if there is no agreement, I think it will have negative consequences on the region.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you. Mohammad, if you want, just make it brief, if you will, please. We're running out of time.
Yes. I just wanted to say that the Revolutionary Guards are not opposed to the nuclear deal. They work within the framework of the Supreme National Security Council, and they cannot do anything without consent of the state. The only problem with the nuclear deal is whether Biden wants to remove the sanctions or not. He wants to keep some of the sanctions, and the Iranians won't accept that. And we have no doubt, if there is war in this region, Iran won't be destroyed. The Americans cannot win a conventional war in this region, and that is why the Americans are not going to act against Iran. So the smart thing for the Americans to do is to abide by their commitments within the framework of the JCPOA, and then the deal can work. Otherwise, there's not going to be a deal.
There's a problem, however, of the wall that President Trump built, a wall of new sanctions, and that also is one of the problems.
All right. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Robust discussion. Really appreciate it. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.